structure that I really want to show you is right over here. This is the Leaning Tower of Pisa on our campus here. And the person that's built it is right around the corner here. It's Brian Varney. Brian, careful that corner. Brian is a 1990 graduate of Northern, and he's going to tell us a little bit about this amazing structure.
Well, it's, as you can see, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it's about 12,000 blocks. It took over 2 weekends to build, and I'm really excited because next week the Guinness Book of World Records team are going to come to evaluate it, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, that must be pretty exciting. What other projects have you done?
Just after 9/11, I did the Empire State Building, and last Christmas I did the Rockefeller Center.
That's great. Maybe you can tell me. Oh, excuse me. It's a little embarrassing. Probably should turn this off. You're going to have to excuse me. I've got to take this. I'm really sorry. Hello?
What we have now is a world of software and applications that are freely given and easily accessible now more than anyone could have foreseen 4 to 6 decades ago. We have free software for games, engines, DAWs, word processors, operating systems, IDEs, text editors, compilers. The list goes on and on. Most of the populace generally takes the liberty of using the software for their own purposes, which was originally the point to begin with, to use the software as you see fit. At least, that was the idea initially. But that freedom isn't exactly appreciated or understood as much unless you're looking at the software from the perspective of a developer. In the mainstream market, especially in gaming, we've been conditioned to the free-to-play formula that's been shoved down our throat, even dating all the way back to the 2000s. The game is free to download and play, but with a lot of caveats, like locked content, faster gear progression if you pay, cosmetics, microtransactions, and so on. The real price lays in the time that you invest, because the longer you stay, the more likely you are to eventually fork money towards something. RuneScape has a decent amount of content for free-to-play players, but to get 75% of the whole experience, you need to become a member. It's one of the fairer models in comparison to many other MMOs released after the original WoW, which also goes doubly for the eastern side of the MMO genre. And now we can't really escape its shadow. Even the most polished multiplayer shooters like CSGO took the free-to-play multiplayer later on. In multiplayer, the model has become so successful that it's become a standard on its own, where being free-to-play is a requirement to compete against the other behemoths. There are exceptions, of course, like Escape from Tarkov. As for single player, there are lots of them, but are generally pushed aside in favor of more polished and shinier products. Mind you that this reality is only within the mainstream area of consumption, but in the world of software development and game development lies a dimension of free games that are not only 100% money free without any catches, but are also open source. This is what we call free and open source. Free and open source is a terminology that states the software being free to not only access but to also tinker with. Developers since the days of the GNU project and Linux have been creating free software to be used and modified into whatever way people wanted to use it. In the case of gaming, it's no different, entirely supported by not only the developers themselves, but also the communities built from them. The free and open source community is a vast ocean, but also a separate entity from the other groups of gaming, where business practices and opportunities for higher streams of revenue drive the AAA companies forward. Free and open source does it all for the sake of creativity and exploration of software, where it's a huge team effort in the name of making great alternative software that's free and readily available to use and modify. In this video, I will be focusing mainly on the games that have come out and go over some of them, as well as providing links to an even larger number of other games in the description. But first, I need to provide a bit of background information as to how it snowballed into what free and open source gaming has become today. Now, I'll try not to drown everyone here in history during this video, but I feel that providing some context and background history is important for the sake of explaining further what free and open source gaming is all about, and what sets it apart from other types of free games, as well as AAA games with a price tag. It's a massive topic, and even then, there's still a lot more to talk about, and many other sides of open source that I can explore. So before the games come the foundations. Now, the term we know it as of today, open source, has technically been an existing practice since the 50s era of computing. But the terminology of open source wouldn't come into play until Eric S. Raymond had coined the term in '98. Now before that though, let's take a quick dive to an earlier period. Now the concepts of computing and assigning instructions actually goes back thousands of years, with devices like the Chinese swanpan, the Roman abacus, the Shango bone from Africa, the Antikythera mechanism from Greece, the slide rule by William Oughtred, and the Babbage difference engine by Charles Babbage were all computing devices made to assist their users and creators in mainly mathematical calculations and measurements. The analog and mechanical nature of these devices were complex but useful tools to perform a number of achievements across a period of time. And all of this was done before anyone could conceive the idea of a digital screen, let alone a machine with electricity, with an array of buttons that could display graphics. Up until the 20th century, more of these analog computers would be created. Eventually, though, later on, electricity would be utilized to create more computational constructs, effectively replacing the need for analog ones entirely. This would create a revolution for computing that hasn't really stopped since. We've only just been able to do it faster and more efficiently over time, and a great deal of it was due to the effect of Unix. Since the 50s, people within institutions had been creating and sharing software within their own collective, taking and implementing what was already created to further develop the operating systems and languages that were developed over time. But there was a limit to its access, since it was largely shared by people in academia, people in the corporate world, and as well as the government, working alongside each other. This really wasn't something that the public had access to, and they wouldn't for quite a while, until AT&T would come along to try and expand the concepts further. After the failure to implement a time-sharing system known as Multics, which tried to allow multiple users to access its mainframe at the same time, key scientists such as Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie continued working on the idea, and their efforts would pay off in the guise of the Unix OS. This was a massive breakthrough for the operating system world and computer science, and the recruitment of other developers led to the Unix OS being improved upon over time, creating a hierarchical file system, a CLI, and a number of utility programs, along with computer processors and device files. This was an OS originally written in assembler, but would later get rewritten in the C language in the 4th edition. The Unix OS would go to make its nest in many academic institutions across the country, even into startups like Solaris Technologies and Sequent. The continual evolution of this OS would also lead to the concept of distros, starting with BSD, made at the University of California and worked on by the Computer Systems Research Group between 77 and 95. In the middle of that threshold, however, one man would take the ideas and the concepts of Unix and not only create an alternative OS, but also a movement that sowed the seeds for the open source movement to come later on in the 90s. Richard Stallman, the forefather of the GNU project. The GNU project, in contrast to the Unix project, was night and day. While Unix sought to expand upon the usage of an operating system, with its capacity to allow multiple users using the same mainframe, along with a multitude of tools and applications to develop further applications and develop and compile languages over time, the GNU project is built around a philosophy that is a rejection of the practice of capitalism and proprietary software. Richard Stallman was dissatisfied that there was no software that the user could freely get and have complete control over, to exercise their freedoms in the application of said software. The GNU project was both a collective effort and a protest to the practices of proprietary companies like Apple, IBM, and Microsoft that sought to close its source code, only giving the consumers a surface-level experience. The software born from the GNU project, even the very operating system itself, could be transformed or just freely enjoyed and experienced by anyone. Throughout the 80s, a kernel and a compiler for the GNU system would be completed, bringing it one step closer to a practical operating system, enabling it to develop programs within its own systems, to cement its foothold in creating a whole new spectrum of computer science and software development the General Public License was also formed by the Free Software Foundation. In an effort to keep it free and non-proprietary, part of the GPL also states that you cannot apply GPL-covered software in a proprietary system, which means you cannot make a commercial product with GPL software, because then it would go against the foundations of the license and what it stands for, which is to give everyone the freedom to copy, redistribute, understand, study, and modify the free software. Stallman was very adamant in this belief, to the point of creating the FSF, the Free Software Foundation, to educate people in the concept of free software and the ideal set by it. Like the domino effect that Unix had on the creation of the GNU project, the same would also carry over to one of the most widely used operating systems in the entire world, something used by individuals, corporate sectors, and even governments. The Penguin, Linux. The software world was revolutionized in both the proprietary and free software world. While Apple and IBM and Microsoft were going at it, the GNU project and the Free Software Foundation were sowing the seeds for the eventual platform to come late in the early 90s, which would be Linux, developed by Linus Torvald in 1991 during his days at the University of Helsinki. It was originally a project he worked on in his own free time for fun, quite literally as a fun project, as he said, based off of the OS known as Minix, which was also based off of Unix. What he had at the time was a kernel, which is what Linux is, but with feedback from other users of software in both the individual and academic categories, he would apply most of that feedback into developing the kernel further with applications, libraries, compilers, and a shell to develop it more into the OS that we know it as today, with a practical build released as 0.0.1. Other users would be able to contribute to its development, and each release would also see noticeable improvements, but also a number of bugs and issues unique to Linux users. But what started with around 88 files, totaling 231 kilobytes of code, is now over 30 million lines of code, as of today. Linux from 91 up until this point is now one of the most widely used operating systems to this day, featuring a huge list of distribution packages that all have their own designs. As you can see here, each distribution is scalable to being easy and accessible like Ubuntu, and minimalistic and 100% manual like Arch Linux. It's highly customizable, great for programming and developing applications. Its open source nature also gives you a huge number of insights into how operating systems work and why, on top of the majority of its applications also being free and open source. The revolution that Linux set forth has infiltrated the IT infrastructure of not just businesses, but also governments too that also use Linux. In fact, the Android OS itself has a modified version of Linux. As for gaming though, it's better now than it was before, unless you're a NVIDIA user. Gaming for Linux can be traced back as early as '94, when the first Doom was ported to Linux. Throughout the 90s, more ports for other MS-DOS games would be provided, but also a lot of other ones too native to Linux. As for how it compared to Windows at the time, well, it left a lot to be desired. The majority of PC games were mostly ported onto Windows in the late 90s and early 2000s, and despite the support for Linux, there were a lot of technical issues correlating to existing drivers being compatible, or at least workable with the Linux OS, as well as the code written for games on PC, where, like I said, the main demographic was Windows. Linux had lots of users, but in the mainstream gaming market, not a lot of gamers. At least not as many as PC players that used Windows. This meant that Linux users would have slapped on ports of Windows native games that would have its own issues, or would take longer for a proper Linux port, not to mention that the various distros had differing effects in performance results across a number of games. It was easier to target the Windows audience as well because it was just the main operating system that you had to look at. With Linux, you had to look at not just Linux itself, but also the distros made for it and which one had the highest user base. Marketing was its biggest enemy early on, but now it's in a good place thanks to the growing number of Linux users and developers on top of the indie scene and recognition of Linux and what it's accomplished. Nowadays, it's about the same roughly, with almost every game readily available on Linux. From free-to-plays, browser-based games, and fully priced AAA titles, you can play all of them on Linux now. But earlier on in the 2000s and still ongoing, Linux users did in fact have their own library of free games made within Linux that were alternatives to the earlier problems that they had with not getting releases of Windows PC games, or inferior versions of them to say the least. This is where the library of free and open source games come in. Now these games were not only free, but the source code was also available for anyone to access and modify. This is what we call modding, and some proprietary games like Skyrim, Doom and Fallout have some of the biggest modding communities out there because of the modding tools provided for them, or in the case of Doom, the source code itself. But those games are still proprietary, so we don't have full and complete access to those games beyond what is already provided, such as the modding tool or the source code, which even then, you still need a base copy of the game to use it fully. Free and open source games are passion projects created by either small teams and contributors or solo developers and contributors wanting to make games for the Linux platform. And there are lots of them that you can find on GitHub, where a link for it will be in the description of this video. I'm going to go over a few games, some that I fondly remember playing when I was much younger, and newer projects that I really enjoyed. And mind you that these games are also available to play on different operating systems as well, and in the case of Windows are super easy to install with the installer executables that they provide. Number 1, FreeDoom. Now this is a very important thing to clarify. Now as I said, while the source code for the classic Doom games were released, the game itself was still proprietary. This meant that you still needed a copy of the game in order to run the files, but not with FreeDoom. FreeDoom was basically a replacement that was used with the game's source code so that you would get a full game that was also completely free, hence the title FreeDoom. It was released back in 2003 by Chungy Fraggle, and the last update was back in 2019. In order to play it, you would need a game engine to play it, and there were several of them made for Doom, the most well-known being GZ Doom. The game came packed with loads of content, featuring 2 campaigns with over 30 levels each, the multiplayer DM mode with 32 maps. Despite it looking similar to classic Doom, the assets and the levels you see were all created from scratch to provide a Doom experience that was familiar but unique due to the fact that it was quite literally a free version of Doom, and not in the same way as the shareware version of Doom that only provided a portion of the experience. Doom 1 and 2, or as I've recently taken to calling it, Classic Doom, has one of the largest pools of total conversion mods and add-ons that have been shaped, changed and reimagined for the experience of this iconic game. Even fully fledged games released using GZ Doom, the build engine and whatnot. And FreeDoom was one of the earlier projects to add to the table. Would highly recommend trying this out if you want a reimagined version of the classic Doom experience, or if you're just a huge fan of the classic Doom games like me. Number 2, Zero AD. This was a game that reminded me of my earlier days in real-time strategy gaming. Games like the original StarCraft, Brood War, Warcraft 3, Age of Empires 2, Dawn of War 1, Command & Conquer Red Alert 2, and Command & Conquer 3. Zero AD, developed by Wildfire Games, was originally a mod for Age of Empires 2, dating all the way back to 2001, acting as a total conversion project that took Age of Empires 2 back into the early BC setting. But the limitations and outdated engine of that game made it difficult to develop the mod further, so the decision was made to turn it into their own game using their own engine. It was a slow process that was eventually expanded upon and hastened once they released the source code as well as the assets for Zero AD, which meant that other people could contribute to its development and even provide content for it. It's one of the longest running projects in free and open source gaming, and it's come a long way since. This game is highly polished and historically genuine in its attention to detail, from the structures even to the units all being labelled by the languages spoken by each civilization at the time, giving a level of authenticity not often found in a lot of other games. If the setting is too ancient for you, then there are also mods for this game like Millennium AD that take it into the Middle Ages. And there are many mods for this game that either change or enhance the experience entirely that you can find on either mod.io or Nexus Mods. If you want an amazing RTS game that reminds you of the old days, you can't go wrong with this one. Now, remakes are often a wild card, either being something that is better than the original, could be considered just as good or worse than the original. In the case of Uolite, it's a remake that doesn't necessarily try to replace the original, but rather pay homage to it, which is something that you should be trying to do anyway rather than trying to effectively replace it. Oolite is a remake of the 1984 space trading game Elite that was released for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron computers. Developed by David Braben and Ian Bell. The developers of Oolite, Giles Williams and Jens Ayton, looked to make a spiritual recreation of one of the best games ever made in the 80s, but in an object-oriented approach, which is why the remake is called Oolite, due to it being written in an object-oriented language like Objective-C, rather than the assembly language used for the original Elite. This project was originally done for the OS X, but would get a Linux port later on, including Windows. Like the original Elite, you create a commander, and you're immediately thrust out into the universe, just like in the original. This game is pretty much an updated version, so to speak, but with some differences like adopting Newtonian physics, which came from the sequels of Elite released in the 90s. The second biggest difference is in the graphics, where you now have solid objects rather than the wireframes that you had before. Although you can actually toggle the graphics mode to wireframe mode, and it actually looks pretty good still. The main drawback, of course, is that like the original, it's pretty overwhelming in the beginning. The game doesn't have a start to finish. It's pretty much in itself a sandbox where you can go wherever, and the control scheme is quite extensive as well. However, the game is still being worked on, and there is a fairly large modding community that has provided a ton of expansions that all have different features and add-ons, making the game even richer and bigger when played with them. If you're a fan of the original Elite, or even Elite Dangerous, or want a free space sim game that's good, then Oolite has you covered. I will also recommend Pioneer, another one from 2008 made by Tom Morton, that is similar to Oolite, but is more inspired by Frontier Elite 2. Would also recommend these games if you're into space or space sims in general. Number 4, SuperTuxKart. Now I'm a sucker for racing games and an even bigger one for Mario Kart. Now that's a series that will ruin friendships, and this game is no exception. SuperTuxKart looks to essentially remodel and recreate the experience of Mario Kart, but with its own display of courses and characters that are quite literally mascots for both free software and open source software. The graphics look like a lot of those open source games that were in a period where they looked decent on a technical level, but often lacked a distinct art style that gave it an identity and personality. Something that a lot of free and open source arena shooters like Xonotic and Cube 2 had an issue with. But SuperTuxKart embraces its own world and fills it with its own characters, creating a universe of sorts where free and open source software characters are reincarnated as people and have decided to settle their differences by racing in karts. The game is really charming and really fun to play, implementing the same mechanics like boost sliding, item pickups, and yes, even the blue shell moment too. It features a campaign mode that lets you unlock characters and racetracks, single race mode with time trial, follow the leader, single race, and even a Rocket League-like mode for the football fanatics. It's one of the best free and open source racing games that you can find in the free and open source department. Another huge bonus is the built-in downloader for additional characters and racetracks, making it more content rich than it already is. If you're looking for a free and open source racing game, then this should be your first stop. Number 5, Warzone 2100. Here is another classic strategy game that was also pretty unique for its combination of real-time strategy and real-time tactics gameplay. Warzone 2100 was originally a proprietary game released in '99 by Pumpkin Studios and Eidos Interactive. What set the game apart from other strategy games was its approach to creating units, having a persistent setting that carried over after each mission, including a night and day system, but later on the source code for the game would eventually be released, leading to the game being completely free to download and play. The game's most unique feature was its approach to units, like I said. Most strategy games already had pre-made units that you could use based on their function. In Warzone 2100, you had units that you could customize to fit the mission's requirements. It's one of the most unique strategy games that you can get your hands on. Was one of the several other free strategy games released around this time too. The combination of conserving resources and units, repurposing them with different components for each mission, kept the experience fresh every time, and still holds up fairly well for an early 3D strategy game. It's a game not very well known, but is sorely underrated that was overshadowed by other strategy games like StarCraft and Warcraft 3. If you want a truly great strategy game, this is one that you can play. Also, you can find it on Steam now. Number 6, Xonotic. Last year I had talked about this game and how I thought it was an incredibly underrated arena shooter, inspired by Quake, which is considered the forefather of the fast-paced arena shooter genre, a game that also set the standard for making addictive and fun multiplayer at the time. The project goes all the way back to 2001, made by Lee Vermeulen, to make a game heavily inspired by the original Quake, featuring a large pool of maps, game modes, a variety of weapons, power-ups and items layered around the arena, which are all staples of an arena shooter. Across the 2000s, it would be known as Nexus, but over time would later be called Xonotic. Earlier builds of the game still exist, including another version called Rexus. For what it lacked in having a unique art style or an interesting universe, made up for it with its faithful approach to the classic formula of arena shooter gameplay, where the skills and movement mattered more than your accuracy. And a lot of the techniques found in Quake 1 and Quake 3 Arena can also be applied into this game, like rocket jumping, bunny hopping, and strafe jumping. It plays really well. From a technical standpoint, the graphics, while artistically lacking, are also impressive for an early 2000s free game. It still has a dedicated multiplayer community and even a small competitive scene in Xonotic, but if you're struggling to find a match, then you have bots that are scalable in difficulty and aren't too bad. Still though, it's a really good arena shooter that's criminally underrated. Also, a shout out to Cube2 Sauerbraten, another fantastic arena shooter that is also technically an engine, featuring a level editor that lets you make your own levels within the games for multiplayer, or just maps. Like Xonotic, it has a huge variety of maps, but the models aren't as impressive, even for 2000 arena shooter standards. Still though, both of these games are worth checking out. As for newer games, there are a metric ton of them thanks to the platforms of itch.io and Steam. But some that are also worth checking out are Mindustry, a tower defense style game that will be a similar experience to playing Factorio, the second most autistic thing you can do besides getting a PC, and the first being Dwarf Fortress. Q1K3 is a demake of the first Quake, featuring the first two levels for Episode 1. The physics and animations of the weapons and enemies have been scaled down further to fit the older aesthetic going for it, while still being faithful. Endless Sky is another space sim game, inspired more by the Escape Velocity series. Like Elite, it has trading, exploration, and combat, and like Uolite, is also highly moddable. And then there's Minetest, which is in a way like Minecraft, but is treated more like an engine that people can use to make games and mods using Lua, while also providing a multiplayer server where people can make their own servers or join others. If you want a version of Minecraft not owned by Microsoft, then this one will do the job. With the current climate in the gaming market, the idea of remaking older games seems to have become a popular trend lately, and it's largely due to the successful releases of the Resident Evil remakes. The reception for 2 and 4 have been incredibly high, the highest the series has seen for a long time. And the 4 remake has driven people crazy, to the point of modding the demo long before the full release of the game. The domino effect, of course, is that it will prompt other studios to resurrect old franchises with remakes, with the intention of replacing the originals. This is a worrying concern for me personally, because a remake should never be made for the sake of replacing an original piece, especially something that has already made its mark in the history of gaming. Something that is still appreciated and discovered by new players. A remake is supposed to pay homage while adding its own spin, but Capcom and a lot of other companies are also missing another key element entirely: preservation. If their priority is to replace the original games with a new take that modernizes the story and experience taken from the original, then they should at the very least do the original counterparts a service and package it with the remakes. Refactor the source code and make the game applicable to modern operating systems, so that players enjoying the remakes can also play the originals, to see and understand what has been replaced. Now, while a lot of these games are still being sold on Steam and other marketplaces, that is a result of the game still having monetary value and not necessarily being something to preserve. And in the case of remasters, you're still given a surface level experience, and a lot of the times they still have the same issues and bugs that are generally engine related too. A game may be in demand for now, but that interest will dwindle over time, and when it does, it'll get taken down, becoming either abandonware or no longer accessible. With open source, these games can still be developed in perpetuity and can make a mirage of fixes in both the game's code and the engine's database. And the games themselves don't necessarily need to be free for this to be possible either. Just look at the classic Doom games, for instance. where you have the source code available for everyone, but the game itself is still purchasable online. This mistake made by AAA studios isn't found whatsoever in the realm of remaking game engines, where not only old games are resurrected, but the engine is faithfully remade or recompiled and structured to mimic the original game's engine, but in modern software and architecture. Capcom makes remakes to replace the original. Open source developers and contributors in the open source world remake or recreate or preserve in the name of preserving what has now become outdated and needs improving. Some of the most prominent examples are OpenTTD, OpenRA, OpenMW, and more. Some of these projects are made differently, remaking and reverse engineering the old game engine from scratch, cloning the game from existing source code, or through emulators and source ports. But the one thing they have in common is to preserve and make it up to date with modern operating systems, as well as a number of enhancements and improvements. Most of these games haven't been officially updated. Open source projects like OpenMW allow players to continue playing an older game like Morrowind today, and also in a far more efficient way that you would never get in a remaster. The mod load limit alone dwarfs the capabilities of the original Morrowind, and is the reason why projects like this are great for old games. They go beyond the limits due to the updated code and contributions towards it, all without changing anything fundamental about the game whatsoever. And the same is done for a number of other open games, like OpenRA, OpenTTD, OpenXCOM, the FreeSpace 2 source code project. All of these games are not only maintained and updated, but perform better in every way. You do also have emulators that accomplish the same thing, but the grey area of how game files are obtained, especially for retro emulators, is a grey area entirely. With rebuilding the engines from scratch or restructuring what's already there, including the source code, these projects generally under the GPL license are free to improve on the existing proprietary games. OpenMW is free to access and contribute to, but you still need a copy of Morrowind in order to use it. With OpenRA, you can obtain the original Command & Conquer, Tiberian Dawn, and Red Alert source code, which was surprising coming from EA and its history with the community, not to mention the games themselves. OpenTTD is one of many, if not one of the most well-known in terms of recreating old games in the open source community, based off of the original Transport Tycoon game made by Chris Sawyer, featuring a number of enhancements made by the people behind this project. I'm personally not into these type of games, but the complex and intrinsic nature of games like this tend to resonate with a lot of PC players, the same sort of people that enjoy other experiences like Factorio and Dwarf Fortress. I find this to be the best way to preserve old games, but it is also extraordinarily difficult, in some ways more so than making your own game engine or video game, because you have to not only have extensive knowledge of the engine, but also a fundamental understanding towards the vintage approach of game development, as well as the assembly language itself. These projects took years upon years of work, even with the whole open source community behind their back. In some cases, some games have been reverse engineered without the source code, which is honestly a miracle. Same goes with the engine, such as the first Diablo. I'll provide a video link in the description that goes into more detail about it. Now, the terminologies have been distorted over time due to the combination of different iterations of the GNU GPL license, the other licenses used for other open source projects, the application of open source wrapped around proprietary software. The meanings for free and open source seem to be different for everyone. In the case of free software, at least in the Free Software Foundation's terms, is that you can freely use, modify, study, and redistribute the software to other people, and they in turn have the same freedom to do likewise. In the case of open source, it doesn't seem to concern itself with the politics and the ideology of the FSF, because many other users over the period of open source development have taken source code and have done other things with it. Companies like Google have become advocates for open source projects over the years, but are still proprietary, and the source code is still wrapped around other systems that are closed off from access. This is what Richard Stallman and the free software movement are against. While they have similarities between each other, free and open source for instance, it seems that there is a paradoxical conclusion that prevents a unified equilibrium where everyone can be happy. For example, you allow me to take your software and do whatever I wish with it and modify it into my own, but don't allow me to sell it. But if I sell it and close off the source code, I take away the freedom to use that software in whatever way you see fit, and force you to use the system I've already set up. Either way, there is always a freedom that's being taken. The majority of the IT world, including the large companies, tend to identify with the open source term more because it focuses more on practicality and application of good code, where free software is an ideal, a vision for how software should be distributed. Lots of projects are different and don't all share the same license. The rhythm game Osu is under the MIT license with its own rules and stipulations. Other licenses may share similarities but will also have their own restrictions. Most free software applications operate under the GNU GPL license, and with each edition, certain parts of it have also been changed. There's never going to be a right answer in regards to what the best license is to use. It is something that you'll have to draw your own conclusions with as to what the license does for your project, and what kind of project you want to make and how you want to distribute it. In free and open source gaming, a lot of them, like I said, are under the GPL, with the intention of keeping them free and open source, or FOSS for short. So that's my take on free and open source gaming. I didn't go into too much detail about the games because I think they all deserve their own videos, and I had to go into a bit of history and explore other avenues of open source development too. But hopefully this video has been helpful into bringing the subject of free and open source gaming into light. It's a term of free that has been put aside in favor of the free-to-play model due to it being more lucrative. And to be honest, some of these games are actually quite good, but not for those that prefer to have the freedom and flexibility of accessing the source code and modifying it into however they wish. Some games like the classic Doom games, Fallout, Skyrim and Minecraft and other games do make room for extensive modding capabilities, but free and open source games offer it all. They're completely free, source code is accessible, and the game can be modded and improved upon further to enhance the experience. The accomplishments from developers dating all the way back to the days of Alan Turing have culminated into the near infinite stratosphere of software and hardware development that we have today. But free software and open source development have given us a whole new universe where applications can be made or improved on by everybody, and not just companies full of people that you'll never get to interact with or see. There are still lots of new and exciting open source game projects, as well as other projects coming out all the time. I sincerely hope further developments for the existing engines continue on, and that we get new ones for older games that haven't been resurrected in the same way OpenMW has for Morrowind, or say OpenRA for the older Command & Conquer games. You can have the best and most polished product with a price tag imaginable, but you can never beat something that is free. Thank you for watching.